First part, Chapter 5 of Essay on the Creative Imagination. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay on the Creative Imagination by Théodule-Ribot. First part, Analysis of the Imagination. Chapter 5, The Principle of Unity. The psychological nature of the imagination would be very imperfectly known were we limited to the foregoing analytical study. Indeed, all creation whatever, great or small, shows an organic character. It implies a unifying, synthetic principle. Every one of the three factors, intellectual, emotional, unconscious, works not as an isolated fact on its own account. They have no worth save through their union, and no signification save through their common bearing. This principle of unity, which all invention demands and requires, is at one time intellectual in nature, that is, as a fixed idea, at another time emotional, that is, as a fixed emotion or passion. These terms, fixed idea, fixed emotion, are somewhat absolute and require restrictions and reservations, which will be made in what follows. The distinction between the two is not at all absolute. Every fixed idea is supported and maintained by a need, a tendency, a desire, that is, by an affective element. For it is idle fancy to believe in the persistence of an idea which, by hypothesis, would be a purely intellectual state, cold and dry. The principle of unity in this form naturally predominates in certain kinds of creation, in the practical imagination wherein the end is clear, where images are direct substitutes for things, where invention is subjected to strict conditions under penalty of visible and palpable check, in the scientific and metaphysical imagination, which works with concepts and is subject to the laws of rational logic. Every fixed emotion should realize itself in an idea or image that gives it body and systematizes it, without which it remains diffuse, and all affective states can take on this permanent form which makes a unifying principle of them. The simple emotions, fear, love, joy, sorrow, etc., the complex or derived emotions, religious, aesthetic, intellectual ideas, may equally monopolize consciousness in their own interests. We thus see that these two terms, fixed idea, fixed emotion, are almost equivalent, for they both imply inseparable elements, and serve only to indicate the preponderance of one or the other element. This principle of unity, center of attraction and support of all the working of the creative imagination, that is, a subjective principle tending to become objectified, is the ideal. In the complete sense of the word, not restrained merely to aesthetic creation or made synonymous with perfection as in ethics, the ideal is a construction in images that should become a reality. If we liken imaginative creation to physiological generation, the ideal is the ovum awaiting fertilization in order to begin its development. We could, to be more exact, make a distinction between the synthetic principle and the ideal conception, which is a higher form of it. The fixation of an end and the discovery of appropriate means are the necessary and sufficient conditions for all invention. A creation, whatever it may be, that looks only to present success, can satisfy itself with a unifying principle that renders it viable and organized, but we can look higher than the merely necessary and sufficient. The ideal is the principle of unity in motion in its historic evolution. Like all development, it advances or recedes according to the times. Nothing is less justified than the conception of a fixed archetype, an undisguised survival of the Platonic ideas, illuminating the inventor, who reproduces it as best he can. The ideal is a non-entity. It arises in the inventor and through him. Its life is a becoming. Psychologically, it is a construction in images belonging to the merely sketched or outlined type. It results from a double activity, negative and positive, or dissociation and association, the first cause and origin of which is found in a will that it shall be so. It is the motor tendency of images in the nascent state, engendering the ideal. The inventor cuts out, suppresses, sifts, according to his temperament, character, taste, prejudices, sympathies, and antipathies, in short, his interest. In this separation, already studied, let us note one important particular. We know nothing of the complex psychic production that may simply be the sum of component elements and in which they would remain with their own characters, with no modification. the nature of the components disappears in order to give birth to a novel phenomenon that has its own and particular features. The construction of the ideal is not a mere grouping of past experiences. In its totality, it has its own individual characteristics, among which we no more see the composing lines than we see the components, oxygen and hydrogen, in water. In no scientific or artistic production, says Wundt, does the whole appear as made up of its parts, like a mosaic. In other words, it is a case of mental chemistry. The exactness of this expression, which is due, I believe, to J. Stuart Mill, has been questioned. Still, it answers to positive facts. For example, in perception, to the phenomena of contrast and their analogues, juxtaposition or rapid succession of two different colors, two different sounds, of tactile, olfactory, gustatory impressions, different in quality, produces a particular state of consciousness, similar to a combination. Harmony or discord does not, indeed, exist in each separate sound, but only in the relations and sequence of sounds. It is a tertium quid. We have heretofore, in the discussion of association of ideas, very frequently represented the states of consciousness as fixed elements that approach one another, cohere, separate, come together anew, but always unalterable, like atoms. It is not so at all. Consciousness, says Titchener, resembles a fresco in which the transition between colors is made through all kinds of intermediate stages of light and shade. The idea of a pen or of an inkwell is not a stable thing clearly pictured like the pen or inkwell itself. More than anyone else, William James has insisted on this point in his theory of fringes of states of consciousness. Outside of the given instances, we could find many others among the various manifestations of the mental life. It is not, then, at all chimerical to assume in psychology an equivalent of chemical combination. In a complex state there is, in addition to the component elements, the result of their reciprocal influences, of their varying relations. Too often we forget this resultant. At bottom, the ideal is an individual concept. If objection is offered that an ideal common to a large mass of men is a fact of common experience, for example, idealist and realist in the fine arts, and even more so religious, moral, social, and political concepts, etc., the answer is easy. There are families of minds. They have a common ideal because, in certain matters, they have the same way of feeling and thinking. It is not a transcendental idea that unites them, but this result occurs because from their common aspirations the collective ideal becomes disengaged. It is, in scholastic terminology, a universale post rem. The ideal conception is the first moment of the creative act, which is not yet battling with conditions of the actual. It is only the internal vision of an individual mind that has not yet been projected externally with a form and body. We know how the passage from the internal to the external life has given rise among inventors to deceptions and complaints. Such was the imaginative construction that could not, unchanged, enter into its mold and become a reality. Let us now examine the various forms of this coagulating principle in advancing from the lowest to the highest, from the unity vaguely anticipated to the absolute and tyrannical masterful unity. Following a method that seems to me best adapted for these ill-explained questions, I shall single out only the principal forms, which I have reduced to three: the unstable, the organic or middle, and the extreme or semi-morbid unity. 1. The unstable form has its starting point directly and immediately in the reproductive imagination without creation. It assembles its elements somewhat by chance and stitches together the bits of our life. It ends only in beginnings, in attempts. The unity principle is a momentary disposition, vacillating and changing without cessation according to the external impressions or modifications of our vital conditions and of our humor. By way of example, let us recall the state of the daydreamer building castles in the air, the delirious constructions of the insane, the inventions of the child following all the fluctuations of chance, of its caprice, the half-coherent dreams that seem to the dreamer to contain a creative germ. In consequence of the extreme frailty of the synthetic principle, the creative imagination does not succeed in accomplishing its task, and remains in a condition intermediate between simple association of ideas and creation proper. 2. The organic or middle form may be given as the type of the unifying power. Ultimately, it reduces itself to attention and presupposes nothing more, because, thanks to the process of localization, which is the essential mark of attention, it makes itself a center of attraction, grouping about the leading idea the images, associations, judgments, tendencies, and voluntary efforts. Inspiration, the poet Grillparzer used to say, is a concentration of all the forces and capacities upon a single point, which, for the time being, should represent the world rather than enclose it. The reinforcement of the state of mind comes from the fact that its several powers, instead of spreading themselves over the whole world, are contained within the bounds of a single object, touch one another, reciprocally help and reinforce each other. What the poet here maintains as regards aesthetics only is applicable to all the organic forms of creation, that is, those ruled by an immanent logic and, like them, resembling works of nature. In order to leave no doubt as to the identity of attention and imaginative synthesis, and in order to show that it is normally the true unifying principle, we offer the following remarks. Attention is at times spontaneous, natural, without effort, simply dependent on the interest that a thing excites in us, lasting as long as it holds us in subjection, then ceasing entirely. Again, it is voluntary, artificial, an imitation of the other, precarious and intermittent, maintained with effort, in a word, laborious. The same is true of the imagination. The moment of inspiration is ruled by a perfect and spontaneous unity. Its impersonality approaches that of the forces of nature. Then appears the personal moment, the detailed working and long, painful, intermittent resumptions, the miserable turns of which so many inventors have described. The analogy between the two cases seems to me incontestable. Next, let us note that psychologists always adduce the same examples when they wish to illustrate, on the one hand, the processes of the persistent, tenacious attention, and, on the other hand, the developmental labor without which creative work does not come to pass. Genius is only long patience, the saying of Newton, always thinking of it, and like expressions of D'Alembert, Helmholtz, and others, because in the one case, as in the other, the fundamental condition is the existence of a fixed, ever-active idea, notwithstanding its relaxations and its incessant disappearances into the unconscious with return to the consciousness. 3. The extreme form, which from its nature is semi-morbid, becomes in its highest degree plainly pathological. The unifying principle changes to a condition of obsession. The normal state of our mind is a plurality of states of consciousness, polyideism. Through association there is a radiation in every direction. In this totality of coexisting images, no one long occupies first place. It is driven away by others, which are displaced in turn by still others, emerging from the penumbra. On the contrary, in attention, relative monoideism, a single image retains first place for a long time, and tends to have the same importance again. Finally, in a condition of obsession, absolute monoideism, the fixed idea defies all rivalry and rules despotically. Many inventors have suffered painfully this tyranny and have vainly struggled to break it. The fixed idea, once settled, does not permit anything to dislodge it, save for the moment and with much pain. Even then, it is displaced only apparently, for it persists in the unconscious life where it has thrust its deep roots. At this stage, the unifying principle, although it can act as a stimulus for creation, is no longer normal. Consequently, a natural question arises. Wherein is there a difference between the obsession of the inventor and the obsession of the insane, who most generally destroys in place of creating? The nature of fixed ideas has greatly occupied contemporary alienists. For other reasons, and in their own way, they, too, have been led to divide obsession into two classes, the intellectual and emotional, according as the idea or the affective state predominates. Then they have been led to ask, which of these two elements is the primitive one? For some it is the idea, for others, and it seems that these are the more numerous, the affective state is in general the primary fact. The obsession always rests on a basis of morbid emotion and in a retention of impressions. But whatever opinion we may hold on this point, the difficulty of establishing a dividing line between the two forms of obsession above mentioned remains the same. Are there characters peculiar to each one? It has been said, the physiologically fixed idea is normally longed for, often sought, in all cases accepted, and it does not break the unity of the self. It does not impose itself fatally on consciousness. The individual knows the value thereof, knows where it leads him, and adapts his conduct to its requirements. For example, Christopher Columbus. The pathological fixed idea is parasitic, automatic, discordant, irresistible. Obsession is only a special case of psychic disintegration, a kind of doubling of consciousness. The individual becomes a person possessed, whose self has been confiscated for the sake of the fixed idea, and whose submission to his situation is wrought with pain. In spite of this parallel, the distinguishing criterion between the two is very vague, because from the sane to the delirious idea the transitions are very numerous. We are obliged to recognize that with certain workers, who are rather taken up with the elaboration of their work, and not masters directing it, quitting it, and resuming it at their pleasure, an artistic, scientific, or mechanical conception succeeds in haunting the mind, imposing itself upon it even to the extent of causing suffering. In reality, pure psychology is unable to discover a positive difference between obsession leading to creative work and the other forms, because in both cases the mental mechanism is at bottom the same. The criterion must be sought elsewhere. For that we must go out of the internal world and proceed objectively. We must judge the fixed idea not in itself, but by its effects. What does it produce in the practical, aesthetic, scientific, moral, social, religious field? It is of value according to its fruits. If objection be made to this change of front, we may, in order to stick to a strictly psychological point of view, state that it is certain that as soon as it passes beyond a middle point, which it is difficult to determine, the fixed idea profoundly troubles the mechanism of the mind. In imaginative persons this is not rare, which partly explains why the pathological theory of genius, of which we shall speak later, has been able to rally so many to its support and to allege so many facts in its favor. End of first part, chapter 5.